So our subject today is the Emperor Julian, who's one of the most fascinating people ever to hold imperial power in Rome. Now, to understand Julian, it's important to first go back and talk a little bit about the event that in many ways defined who Julian would be and how Julian would rule. And this was the event that occurred following the death of the Emperor Constantine. Now, Constantine had been brought up and had taken power as part of a tetrarchic system, the tetrarchic system created by Diocletian. And Constantine, on a very basic level, understood the advantages of this tetrarchic system. The ability of emperors to share responsibilities, be more responsive to the needs of people in individual provinces, and have regional areas under their direct control. And so when Constantine gave thought to what succession would look like following his death in the 330s, what he decided to do was to create a new tetrarchy. Now, Constantine, of course, had something of a superiority complex. And so when he set this up, instead of having two Augusti and two Caesars, what Constantine did instead is he proclaimed himself the Supreme Augustus. And you see on this coin, Constantine is described as Constantinus Maximus Augustus, and then four Caesars. And the Caesars were each given a region to control. And you can see a similar kind of strategy in the way that the Caesars' portraits are represented. They are represented as somewhat stylized versions of Constantine's own portraiture. Now, one of the issues that Constantine faced is that he wanted this to be an hereditary tetrarchy, a tetrarchy made up of his descendants. And he had three sons. And so that gives you 3/4 of a tetrarchy, but he needed a fourth person. So the fourth person he chose was a man named Dalmatius, who was Constantine's nephew and the son of one of Constantine's father's children from that father's second marriage. And we also know that immediately following the death of Constantine, this whole arrangement fell apart. We're told that Constantius II, probably in collaboration with court officials, almost immediately arranged for the execution of Dalmatius and also the execution of all of the other male relatives of Constantine, especially those who came from Constantine's father's second marriage, with the exception of two people. Gallus, who was at that point extremely ill, and so the assassins felt like it wasn't necessary to kill him, and Julian, who was very, very young. And so we're told by Libanius that Constantine no sooner ended his life than the sword passed through almost his whole house, fathers and children alike. But Julian escaped the general massacre as well as his elder brother Gallus by the same father. And Gallus escaped because he was ill, which was supposed to result in his death, and Julian escaped because of his tender age. Now, some people have tended to think that Julian is something of a usurper. I mean, somebody who, when he challenges for the imperial throne, wasn't legitimately able to claim this. But the actual picture is actually quite different. Julian, in reality, Libanius says, there's nothing I cannot parade for his glorification, because as regards his family, his grandfather was an emperor, one who above all others held riches in contempt, and in a special degree won the affection of his subjects. And his father was the son of an emperor and the brother of another. And the brother of another is Constantine. And Julian's father had a better right to the throne than the one who got it. Nevertheless, he didn't assert the claim, but he wished success to Constantine, who had seized power and continued to live under him in sincerity and affection. Now, Libanius is a very favorable source for Julian, but when he says these things, he's not really lying, because the reference to Julian's father having a better right to the throne than Constantine was, strictly speaking, true. Constantius may or may not have been married to Helena, Constantine's mother, but when Constantius was elevated into the Tetrarchy, he was forced to break off the relationship with Helena, if he was still in one, and he married the daughter of the Tetrarch Maximian when he took imperial power. And they had lots and lots of children, including Julian's father. So Constantine was the son of Helena, while Julian's father was the son of Constantius's new wife. And by the laws of inheritance, if Constantius had never married Helena, Julian's father would have a clear and uncontested right of primacy to the throne. And if Constantius had married Helena but had divorced her, still at the same time, Julian's father possibly had more right to the throne than Constantine. And so when you think about things from the perspective of Constantine's sons, it made sense that they would institute or they would initiate this massacre. And in particular, Constantius, who was in the east, the allotted territories that he had contained most of the family members of Constantine. And so he in particular was susceptible to the possibility of a revolution. But the murder had a profound effect on Julian because he grew up without a father. He grew up with the understanding and the knowledge that his father had been murdered for really no good reason. And while he was a youth, he was put under the care of the imperial court, kind of guarded in an almost loose imprisonment. And making matters worse, while he was a youth, the succession arrangements set up by Constantine completely fell apart. Not only was Dalmatius killed immediately, but Constantine II and Constans fought a civil war almost immediately following this. And then Constans won this, and in 350, when Julian was still relatively young, a young teenager, Constans was overthrown by Magnentius. And Magnentius's victory was met by an attack coming from the eastern court of Constantius II. Constantius defeated Magnentius and assumed sole control of the empire in 353, but even Constantius recognized that there was a need to delegate authority. Even he recognized that he could not control the empire alone. And so he brought his cousin Gallus in as Caesar. And while Constantius campaigned in the west and worked to solidify his control over this territory that he had just taken from Magnentius, Gallus was sent to the east. And Gallus was sent to the east to basically manage affairs in the eastern provinces, and he based his court in the city of Antioch. Now, while this was happening, Julian was getting a very carefully supervised education. His teachers were selected by Constantius, and they were often Christians. And they spent a great deal of time and energy getting Julian to think about Christian religious subjects. And so as a child, Julian is a Christian, and he's raised as a Christian, and his education is designed to, if anything, make him more knowledgeable about Christianity. And Julian's first teacher, a man named Mardonius, was a figure that Julian actually liked quite a bit, because Mardonius was Christian, but he also had other interests, and Julian was a precocious and intellectually gifted student. And so Mardonius indulged those gifts and indulged those interests. But eventually, Julian moved on to other teachers, and these later teachers were less good. And so Eunapius writes about this as these later teachers were eunuchs from the palace who were assigned to keep watch on him so that he might not waver from the Christian faith. But he had their books so thoroughly memorized that they fretted at the scantiness of their erudition, since there was really nothing that they could teach the boy. And so Julian begged his cousin's permission to attend regular schools, the schools of the sophists and lectures on philosophy. And Constantius, as the gods willed, permitted this, because he wished for Julian to browse among books and to have leisure for them, rather than to leave Julian to reflect on his own family and his claim for the empire. Now, Eunapius is ascribing motives to Constantius that Constantius probably didn't at this moment have. Julian was, in a sense, an extra family member. Gallus had been brought in to serve as the deputy to Constantius. Julian was kind of an extra figure who could be indulged if he wanted to. And he was young, and Constantius at this point had no reason to think that Julian studying sophistry and philosophy would matter in the least. And so he permitted him to do this, not because he wanted Julian to not rebel, but just because he didn't particularly care what Julian was up to. As long as Julian kind of kept his head down and did what was expected of him, then that was fine. Eventually, though, Julian went to study philosophy in Pergamum under the prominent teachers Maximus of Ephesus and Chrysanthus. And Maximus is a key figure in this. Maximus was a wonder worker and a very charismatic teacher, and he positively enchanted Julian. So while Julian was in Pergamum, but before Maximus had come to teach him there, Julian heard one of his professors describe Maximus and a ritual that was performed in one of the city's temples. And the ritual went like this. Maximus invited some of his fellow philosophers to this temple, and then he burned a grain of incense and recited to himself the whole of some hymn or another, and was so highly successful in his demonstration that the statue of the goddess first began to smile and then began to laugh aloud. And before Maximus could finish, the torches in her hand burst into flame. And when Julian heard this, he said to his teacher, "Farewell and devote yourselves to your books, because you have shown me the man I was in search of." Now, Maximus is something that's called a theurgist. And to some pagans, this meant that he was a particularly skilled holy man. A theurgist, in essence, performs rituals that bring the gods into close communication with a worshiper. This is in some ways similar to what we saw with the mystery cults and the Mithraic ritual or Mithraic liturgy that we discussed when we talked about these cults earlier. But a theurgist is not working in that particular capacity. He's instead a philosophically inclined person who understands these rituals as a way to kind of jump over the lines of division that separate the gods and man. And so the theurgist is somebody who is able to bring you into communion with the gods because of the particular understanding that he has. And Maximus was the best of all of these. And so pagans who believed these sorts of things saw in Maximus an incredibly skilled holy man. But other people saw him as simply a magician, and that also makes some sense, because the idea of what magic was in many people's minds was that magic was in a sense a way to compel the gods to do something for you. It was in essence like the cheat code that could get the gods to come down and do something that the gods otherwise wouldn't be inclined to do. But your magical work compelled them to do this. Now, what Maximus and other theurgists would say is they are not compelling the gods to do anything. They're inviting the gods into communion, and the gods accept willingly and eagerly. And so this is different from magic, where the gods in essence are being compelled to do something. Here, you are appealing to them, and they are particularly excited to come and interact with you. Now, conventionally, Maximus has been held responsible for Julian's conversion from Christianity to paganism. But what Eunapius describes here is something a little bit different. Julian was already inclined in this direction. Julian was very interested in philosophy, but he was interested in a specifically theological way of understanding philosophy, a philosophy that not just taught ethical principles, but taught one how to move beyond the world of the material and move towards communion with the gods. And what Maximus offered was a more spectacular version of this. And so Julian was already inclined to do the kinds of things that Maximus had to offer. And so while Maximus was not entirely responsible for Julian's conversion to paganism, the education that Julian got in Pergamum and later in Nicomedia did turn him towards paganism. And by the time he left the school in Pergamum, he was secretly a pagan. And then following a period of study under Maximus, Julian traveled to Athens. But he didn't last long in that city. And it's interesting because in Athens, he's actually a fellow student with Gregory Nazianzen. They knew each other, they interacted with each other, they did not like each other. Gregory actually despised Julian, and we could understand why. But while Julian spent a short time in Athens, while this was happening, Constantius had executed Gallus and then had decided that Julian should be elevated in Gallus's place. And so while Julian is in Athens, he receives word that Constantius wants to remove him from the classroom and instead elevate him to the rank of Caesar to serve as Constantius's colleague in the empire. And what Eunapius then says is as soon as he was made Caesar, Julian was sent to Gaul. And Eunapius says, not so much to rule there as with the intention that he should perish by violent means. Now, Eunapius alleges that Constantius elevated Julian and sent him to Gaul because Constantius wanted Julian to die. Now, that superficially maybe makes some sense, but in reality, there's no way that this is what Constantius actually wanted to do. What Constantius was hoping to do was to have somebody from the family present in Gaul so that the military campaigns that needed to be conducted in Gaul could be conducted, and the general who did it would be serving under the official command of a member of Constantine's family. And so Julian was basically a family figurehead who was sent there to administer things to the degree that he could, but really just to represent the family so that there wasn't another rebellion like Magnentius's rebellion. And Julian was chosen because, frankly, he was the only person left. Constantius had killed all other male relatives except for his brothers and Gallus. The brothers had killed each other, and then Magnentius had killed one of them, and Julian and Constantius then killed Gallus. So Julian was all that was left. Constantius needed another family member to be present in the West, and the only person who could do it was Julian. Now, to pretty much everybody's surprise, Julian didn't go to Gaul and serve as a kind of cipher. Julian had no military training. He had maybe read about some things in his schooling, but he really didn't know how to command an army. He had no background in this at all. He's a young person. I mean, he's still basically in his early 20s while he's fighting in Gaul. But what we see is when he gets to Gaul, he surprises everybody with his capacities. He functions really quite effectively in Gaul. And so Ammianus says that by a series of rapid steps, Julian attained such distinction both at home and abroad that in his wisdom he was reckoned the reincarnation of Titus and Vespasian. In the glorious outcome of his campaigns, he was very much like Trajan, and he was as merciful as Antoninus Pius, and in striving after truth and perfection, he was the equal of Marcus Aurelius. And so what we see here is that Ammianus is referring back to figures that he has already discussed in his history. Ammianus doesn't talk about Titus and Vespasian, but he does talk about Trajan, Antoninus, and Marcus. And what Ammianus is doing here is he's giving you a roster of really important and successful and idealized emperors. And so Julian shows himself, at least in the eyes of people who really like Julian, to be the equal of all of the roster of greatest Roman emperors. But as notable as Julian was for his effective administration in Gaul, he was equally notable for his military successes. And we know from Julian's own writings that his administrative capacities were developed through close study of Platonic ideals. And so what he's actually doing when he's running the empire is he's implementing these ideas that come from Platonic teaching. And specifically, as my student Jamie Marvin has shown, specifically comes from a reading of Plato's Laws. Now, as effective as he is as an administrator, Julian is actually even more notable as a really successful military commander. And so, for example, what we see is Julian undertakes a series of strategies that really are unprecedented in the 4th century. Julian's Julian's strategy is to really move quickly, to divide his forces when possible, and to surprise enemies by basically showing up in multiple places at once with small forces. And this works really spectacularly in Gaul. And so to give just one example of this, outside of Autun, on June 24th, Julian arrives like a seasoned commander. And to avoid delay, Julian took with him only the cuirassiers and artillerymen, an inadequate escort for a commander, and he reached Auxerre by a shortcut, and then after a short halt to refresh his troops and himself, Julian made his way to the city of Troy, and there the barbarians hurled themselves upon him in successive bands. In some cases, when their superior numbers alarmed him, he did no more than close ranks and keep an eye on the enemy. At other times, he won an easy victory by descending on them from a vantage point. And so what we see is that Julian's strategy in Gaul is to confront barbarian menaces not by assembling a large army and forcing a pitched battle and having the superior numbers of the Romans overwhelm the barbarians. What Julian is instead counting on are a couple of things. First of all, the Roman army in the 4th century is a very powerful professional military. The people serving in this is their job. This is what they do all the time. They train and they fight and they win these battles because they are simply better prepared and more capable. And what Julian understood was better prepared and more capable troops can be deployed strategically and can be utilized in specific circumstances. And so if they are going to be overwhelmed by the superior numbers of the barbarians, these troops would be wasted if you threw them into a battle where they're likely to be killed. But they're also not likely to be attacked, because if they have a good defensive position, the barbarians are going to be loath to attack more and better trained troops. And so what Julian did is he used these troops strategically. He would separate them out so that they could move quickly. He would use them when the circumstance dictated it, and he would attack when he could do this and he had a superior position, but otherwise he would wait. And these tactics work magnificently. After about 3 years of campaigning along the Rhine, Julian had completely calmed the situation. But Julian's success hadn't been occurring in a vacuum, because while Julian had been winning these significant victories in the West, Constantius was actually struggling to respond to a major Persian attack that came in the East. In 359, the Persians had taken the fortified city of Amida. And so you see on this map the area along the Rhine, Germania 1, Germania 2, and you see Julian's campaigns, and the places where Julian was campaigning were really areas around where you see the Franki, and to a lesser degree the Alemanni. And these campaigns were remarkably successful, but if you look to the east, you can see just at the far corner, the far right corner of the map, right where you see Mesopotamia being you see the MES, M-E-S. Right above that MES is the city of Amida. And in 359, when this city falls, it is a really, really significant threat to the border structure that the Romans have. It's a real threat because if Amida stays under Persian control, this opens Syria and even parts of Asia Minor to repeated Persian attacks. And so Constantius needs to marshal a large army to take back Amida and to attack the Persians. And what he realizes is that Julian has effectively taken the frontier and stabilized it. And so Julian doesn't need as many troops as he had. But there's another aspect to this as well. Constantius is very concerned about the loyalty of Julian. And we're told by Ammianus that that Constantius became very much aware of Julian's popularity. And so while Constantius was trying to reinforce the East, he was also concerned about the reports of Julian's exploits that he was hearing. And concerned about this, Constantius sent a government official to Julian and told Julian via this official that Julian's auxiliaries, people from the Herulian and Batavian barbarian groups, together with some Celts and Petulantes and 300 men from every other division of his army, were all to be separated out and sent to the east to fight under Constantius and fight against the Persians. And so what we see is that Constantius responds to Julian's success in a couple of ways. One way is totally reasonable. He realizes Julian doesn't need as many troops as Julian has. And so Constantius asks to transfer some of the troops under Julian's command, where they aren't really needed, to the east so they can be under Constantius's command. And this is reasonable. But what Constantius actually does is less reasonable. Because instead of transferring entire divisions, what Constantius does is he actually takes auxiliaries who had been contractually guaranteed that they would only stay in their home region, and he tells them that they must leave their home region despite these guarantees and go to the east and fight the Persians. This is a real problem, right? These are people from Northern Europe. They don't want to go to Syria and Mesopotamia and fight in the summer. People who are used to the climate of Belgium don't really do well in the climate of Iraq. And so these auxiliaries are not happy about this. But even more interesting, and of course these unhappy auxiliaries are not going to be happy with Julian if Julian allows them or forces them to agree to this. But even more interesting and even more divisive is Constantius's decision to break up the Roman regular military units under Julian's control. Because instead of transferring entire groups, what he does is he actually compels Julian to choose 300 out of each group and send them away. And so he breaks up the groups. There might be a reason, there might be a way to understand this as a reasonable thing, right? Maybe these are the best troops from each of these groups, but you are breaking up the families in essence. The military units that are used to training and fighting together are, in a way, a kind of family. And Constantius is deliberately breaking these up because these families had become intensely loyal to Julian. And so Constantius, from a military perspective, is perfectly asking something that's perfectly reasonable. But from a morale perspective, it's clear he is trying to break up the intense loyalty that these soldiers felt to Julian. And Julian is extremely unhappy about this. His auxiliaries, of course, are incensed. They don't want to do this. They don't want to be summoned away by Constantius, and they are perfectly willing to listen to some kind of alternative. And the regular troops are too. And so what happens, we're told, is that the troops rise up in revolt against Constantius and proclaim Julian emperor. Now, of course, this isn't exactly how it happened. No army will proclaim someone emperor unwillingly. And so there was certainly a back and forth about this. And you can see that Julian was aware of this because Julian spends the winter in Paris, not in the place where you would normally keep. I mean, Paris now, obviously, you would like to spend your winter in Paris. It's a nice place to be. It was not then. Julian actually talks about how he's sort of stuck on the Ile-de-France, and he's watching like icebergs go down the Seine. Paris is not a particularly nice place to be, and Julian intentionally chose this as his winter camp because he wanted to figure out what he was going to do in response under cover. The emissaries from Constantius didn't want to be in Paris. And so Julian very clearly works with the leaders of his army and plans out a spontaneous, in sort of scare quotes, acclamation of Julian as Augustus. And Julian, of course, accepts this because this is something that Julian planned. This is something that Julian wanted. And then Julian figures out how he's going to fight this civil war against Constantius that he's now basically declared. And Julian understands a few things. First of all, he has far fewer troops than Constantius. Second of all, Constantius is really good at civil wars. He defeated Magnentius in a particularly grinding civil war, and Constantius's strategy in fighting Magnentius was quite brilliant. The strategy was to accumulate as much force as he could and to move slowly and deliberately and arrange so that Magnentius could only fight pitched battles against superior forces. And this is how Constantius responded to Julian. But Julian decided that, because he has numerical inferiority, the thing that could make Julian's endeavor successful was to follow the same kind of plan that he had followed in attacking people in Gaul. And so he divided his army, and he sent part of the army to make a rapid approach into Italy, while the rest, under the command of his cavalry commander, was to advance through what's now areas of Austria and down into the Balkans. And by being dispersed in this way over different regions, they would give the impression of vast numbers and spread alarm everywhere, a strategy, we're told, employed by Alexander the Great. Now, the advantage of this plan was clear. Julian, with inferior forces, would seize large parts of the West quickly and do it before Constantius could react. But Julian's forces were spread too thin, and if they encountered a real army, they would be easily crushed, and people understood this. And so Julian's forces did descend into Italy very quickly, force Italy to kind of proclaim him emperor, but they couldn't actually hold Italy. And the city of Aquileia actually rebelled against Julian, and Julian really struggled to maintain control of these areas that his rapid force advance had taken over. And Constantius planned to cause the very problem that Julian feared. Constantius pulled back from Persia. Julian's revolt was in 361, and Constantius spent much of 361 assembling a large army to fight Julian and blocking Julian's advance further down into the Balkans. And so Constantius first fortified a number of passes that would prevent Julian from getting down from the northern Balkans into Greece. And then he just began moving slowly and methodically, assembling troops so that he could confront Julian. And had these armies fought, Julian would have been crushed. There's absolutely no way that a commander as careful as Constantius would have lost to a commander who in many ways is reckless, and Julian was reckless in the way that he undertook this. But fortunately for Julian, Constantius died before the battle actually took place. And this in and of itself is surprising, because Constantius was only 44 years old. And so Constantius's death in November of 361 is really shocking. And before his death, we're told Constantius named Julian as his successor. Now, did he really do this? I think we could have our doubts. But Constantius's army understood there was nobody there who was legitimately in power. Julian was a member of the family of Constantine, and lacking leadership, the easiest thing was to just say, yes, Constantius said that Julian was his heir, and reorganize and reunify the empire without fighting a civil war. And so they did. And so Julian was the new emperor. And one of the first actions that Julian took was to reveal his true religious convictions. And so we're told by Ammianus that Julian had from his boyhood nursed an inclination towards the worship of the traditional gods. And this grew into an ardent passion as Julian grew older. But fear of the consequences had kept him from practicing pagan rituals, except in the greatest possible secrecy. But now that Constantius was dead, that fear was removed. And he revealed what was in his heart and directed in plain, unvarnished terms that the temples should be open, sacrifices should be brought to their altars, and the worship of the old gods restored. Now, Julian himself would write about why this happened. And Julian communicates and explains that he believes that Zeus had chosen him for this mission, and that Zeus personally protected him. And the reason that Julian was able to win these ridiculous military victories was because Zeus enabled that. Because the traditional gods enabled that. The reason that Constantius died before this battle that would almost certainly have killed Julian is because the gods favored Julian. And so Julian has a similar conviction that his religious beliefs are correct to what Constantine had. Both of them had a similar experience, a kind of conversion to a religion, and then incredible, almost unexplainable successes that come about following that conversion. And so when Julian announces his conversion to Christianity, or from Christianity to paganism, we see a change in the way that Julian represents himself. So the Julian who was Caesar under Constantius looks like Constantius. But the Julian who is a pagan emperor as an Augustus, changes his outlook, changes his impression. You can see he now has the beard of a philosopher, reflecting his own intellectual inclinations. The reverses of his coins have imagery that evoke sort of pagan themes, and Julian institutes all sorts of things to try to encourage sacrifice, reopen temples, and have property that had been taken from temples and from pagans under Constantius in particular restored to those people and to those shrines. Now, what Julian's conversion also reflects is a new opinion about Christianity and the emperor who had first proclaimed it. And so we've already seen something of how Julian describes Constantine. Julian believes that Constantine came to Christianity because Constantine was a wicked figure, because he did horrible things, because he is a seducer, because he's a murderer, because he's sacrilegious. And the only God that could cleanse him, that could make him not guilty and not suffer for these crimes, was Jesus. And so this is how Julian frames Constantine's conversion, not as a kind of enlightened embrace of this new and progressive way of understanding the approach to the gods, but as somebody who had no other choice, somebody that could only be accepted by Jesus. That was the only divine figure who would actually accept Constantine. And with the empire under his control, Julian attempts to revitalize the paganism that he feels is the true and proper way for Romans to behave religiously. But in doing this, he follows a model actually put in place by Constantine. He institutes a policy of religious toleration. But the policy of religious toleration that Julian creates is one that's designed to sow chaos in the Christian community. And so part of his policy of religious toleration is to take all of the bishops that Constantius had exiled because they didn't agree with his Christology or because they were creating kind of divisions in the cities, and he recalls all of them back. And so in Alexandria, Athanasius is brought back to the city of Alexandria to argue with the Arian clergy that Constantius had favored. And Julian relishes this. Now there will be Donatist and Catholic bishops in Carthage, and Arian and Nicene bishops in the cities across the eastern Mediterranean. And this is something that Julian wants to do because it shows the incoherence of Christianity. And it also prevents the Christian church from responding effectively to other religious reforms that Julian wants to undertake. And so Julian institutes financial support for temples. He created a kind of organized hierarchical pagan priesthood to try to bring some order and regular calendrical celebrations of paganism in each province, and in every city across the empire. And the pagan priests are not just supposed to manage the religious calendar, they're also supposed to set up religious institutions. They're supposed to give out charitable contributions to poor people like the Christian church had done, and they're supposed to supervise pagan religious observances. And this is, of course, very different from how paganism had worked before. Paganism was not an organized religion. Pagans didn't even recognize other pagans as people who belonged to the same religious community as themselves. And so what Julian does is he creates, in a sense, a culture and a structure that is supposed to make paganism come together. But one of the problems inherent in this move is for Julian, who is a conversion to paganism, or a convert to paganism from Christianity, Julian shares this Christian idea that there's such a thing as paganism. But most pagans who weren't Christians first didn't understand this. They worshiped the gods they worshiped, and they looked at people who worshiped different sorts of gods as kind of weirdos. If you are, for example, a devotee of the Eleusinian mysteries in Athens, you would still look at Elagabalus's rock god and say, that's just bizarre. How can a rock be a god? There is no common pagan identity, and Julian is trying to create one. But he's trying to create one using a conception of religion that on its basic level says that who you worship is a reflection of who you are. And Christians thought that way. But pagans didn't think that way. And so there was already a kind of tension between what Julian is trying to make paganism and what many pagans actually think paganism is. They don't think it's anything. And Julian very much thinks that it's not just one thing, but it's one thing that can be encouraged and organized. And so there's going to be tension there. Another thing that Julian does that reflects this way of seeing paganism was quite controversial, because Julian attempts to regulate the religious content of Roman education. And this attempt occurs in two stages. The first is this law, a law that says that masters of studies and teachers ought to first excel in personal character and then in eloquence. And so if anyone wishes to teach, he shall be referred to me, the emperor, for consideration, so that such teachers may enter upon their pursuits with a certain higher honor because of our judgment, i.e. the emperor's judgment. And so the first stage of this is Julian simply saying there must be a sort of character evaluation before anyone teaches students in a classroom. And no one then or now would disagree with this. You don't want somebody with a bad character or with a bad history or with bad behavior teaching students, because they will encourage bad behavior in those students. They need to model the good behavior they're supposed to be teaching for students to really understand this. Now, the law describing the next stage in Julian's reform is lost because it was quickly reversed after Julian's death. But what we do have is Julian's letter to a governor explaining how he wants the second phase of this educational reform to work. And so Julian says, I hold that a proper education results not in laboriously acquired symmetry of phrases and language, but in a healthy condition of the mind. I mean a mind that has understanding and true opinions about things that are good and evil. And therefore, when a man thinks one thing and teaches his pupils another, in my opinion, he fails to educate. And so Julian basically begins by saying, again, something that's not totally disagreeable, that a teacher must have a ordered understanding about what good and evil is before he starts teaching people about good and evil. And if he doesn't, then he's failing to educate. But what Julian then goes on to say is something that a lot of people did find problematic. I don't say then that Christian teachers ought to change their opinions and instruct the young. Instead, I give them this choice. Either don't teach the things which they don't think are honorable, or if they wish to teach, they must persuade their students that neither Homer nor Hesiod nor any one of these authors about whom they lecture is guilty of any impiety. And so this is a key thing, because it says that teachers not only must believe what they're teaching, but they need to actually not just use their teaching to inform, but use their teaching to persuade. And so they don't just inform students about what Homer or Hesiod wrote, they instead have to persuade their students that what Homer and Hesiod are saying is pious and true. And so now education has changed. It's not a introduction to a cultural patrimony. What Julian wants it to be is an indoctrination in paganism. And any teacher who's not going to do this is not allowed to teach anymore. And so Julian says, let there be an ordinance in effect that any youth who wishes to attend school is not excluded, nor indeed is it reasonable to shut out from the best way boys who are still too ignorant to know which way to turn. For we ought, I think, to teach, but not punish the demented. Now what Julian is saying here is, every student who wants to go to school, Christian or pagan, can go to school. But school is now going to be something where if you go, your teachers are going to persuade you to accept pagan ideas. And Julian wants everybody to do this. Pagan or Christian, he wants every student to still go to school. Because he feels like, as happened to him, a Christian student who goes in and is taught these ideas will learn that they're correct. And a Christian student who goes to school and learns these ideas will be taught to be pagan. This is what Julian wants. And Julian believes this will work because this is what happened to him. Now, what we see is that Julian is also particularly interested in putting Christian teachers in a difficult position. So, Victorinus, the Latin philosopher who converted publicly to Christianity, and Prohoresius, the Greek rhetorician teaching in Athens, who also has been a Christian, or also is a Christian, Julian actually makes an example of them. Both of them are the most prominent Christian intellectuals in a traditional educational setting in their respective regions. And so what Julian says is, you guys can continue to teach. I will give you an exemption if that's what you want to do. But of course, if they do that, they lose their credibility as Christian intellectuals because they've now compromised with the emperor. And other Christians who suffer under what they see as an intellectual persecution, they will look at Prohoresius and Victorinus, if they continue to teach, as basically people who betrayed the cause. And so what Julian is trying to do here is, again, create divisions in the Christian community. Divisions between intellectuals who might still want to teach and people who see them as examples. And it's notable that neither Victorinus nor Prohoresius takes Julian up on this. Both of them agree to stop teaching and do not accept Julian's exemption. And of course, Julian doesn't particularly care that they did this. He wanted to put them in a difficult position. But the problem with Julian's educational reform is almost no one in the empire wants education to be seen this way. Everyone, both pagan and Christian, including Ammianus, who is a great champion of Julian, wants education to be this unifier, this thing that is a common cultural patrimony that both Christians and pagans can access because it's supposed to unify the elites of the empire. And if you make it exclusively pagan and you exclude Christians from it, you're fracturing this elite consensus and you're creating divisions that elites do not want to have. They want to still have this system where someone from Syria can go to Rome and his credentials will be recognized as something that admits him into the circle of the elite in the capital. They want that, and Julian is endangering that. And so there is real pushback to this. Now, one final really interesting policy of Julian's concerns the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. Now, Julian is interested in this for a couple of reasons. First, because Julian had been taught that Christianity represented a new, improved, and better Judaism. And the truth, some Christians said, of this promise was that the temple had been thrown down, the Jews no longer had their temple, and that Christianity represented the next phase in this particular religious tradition because the Jews had done something bad. And God had made them lose their temple because of this, and Christianity was supposed to supplant Judaism. And so one thing that Julian wanted to do was to point to Christians that this was wrong. That there was now a Jewish temple, that God had allowed this to happen, and therefore this was a kind of ridiculous claim that invalidated some of what made Christianity compelling. But there was another reason too. Julian really did believe that regional gods needed to be supported. And Julian saw the Hebrew God as a regional god who needed to be supported. And Julian saw the destruction of the Hebrew temple, the Jewish temple, as something that was akin to the destruction of other regional gods' temples. He wanted to bring it back because, again, as a polytheist, he's a pagan, but he's really a polytheist in the truest sense of the word. Yahweh is a god to Julian. And the traditional worship of Yahweh was done at a temple in Jerusalem. And Julian felt like that was something that could be restored. Now, would this have implications for Christians? Yes. But it also was something that Julian wanted particularly to do because it was consistent with his way of understanding religion. So Ammianus describes it this way. Julian desired to leave a great monument to perpetuate the memory of his reign, and this led him to think in particular of restoring at enormous expense the once magnificent temple at Jerusalem, which after much bitter fighting had finally been stormed with great difficulty. And he set to work boldly, assisted by the governor of the province, but repeated and alarming outbursts of fireballs near the foundation made it impossible to approach the spot. Now, the picture on the right is the Temple Mount. You can see below, you can see the Western Wall, the pediment on which the Herodian temple was erected. Now, on that Temple Mount at that moment was, it seems, a temple to Jupiter that Hadrian had built following the suppression of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. Now, the site of the original Jewish temple was probably to the right of the grove of trees that you see in the middle. You, of course, see the Dome of the Rock on the left. There's a grove of trees. And then to the right is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Probably that was where the Jewish temple was. In this grove of trees probably was this temple to Jupiter. And if you go and walk around on the Temple Mount now, you can see column capitals and pieces of columns that come from that Hadrianic temple. And so what Julian was looking to do, it seems, was rebuild the Jewish temple on this site on the Temple Mount where it had originally been. But we're told this never actually got anywhere. They started doing some foundational work, and then there was outbursts of fireballs near the foundation. Now, who did this? Where did this come from? Well, a traditional explanation is that this is Christians. That Christians don't want Julian to rebuild his temple because of what this will mean for Christian claims about the primacy of Christianity. And it could be Christians. But I think there's also another very interesting option. This could also be Jews. And this is because since Judaism had lost the sacrificial component of its religion, and the temple at Jerusalem was a temple where animal sacrifice occurred. With the destruction of the temple, animal sacrifice did not occur in Jerusalem anymore, and for the most part did not occur in Judaism. And the people who rose up in response to this were the rabbis. And so instead of a priestly class or priestly group that conducted sacrifice and superintended Judaism through the conduction of sacrifice at the temple, the rabbis did something different, and their Judaism was something different. And so what would it mean for the rabbis if Julian rebuilt the Jewish temple in Jerusalem? It's hard to say, but it probably would not be good. It would definitely disrupt the way that Judaism was proceeding in the 4th century. And so who prevented Julian from building this? Was it Christians? Possibly. Was it Jews? Possibly. Was it both? That's also an interesting possibility. We don't know. But what we do know is that Julian didn't get very far in building this. We also can say that because of the nature of the Temple Mount, no one is ever going to excavate that site and figure out what Julian was able to actually accomplish. All we have is the literary evidence. And the literary evidence said nothing much was done except for some work on the foundations. So this gives you a sense of all of the stuff that Julian is up to. It's also important to emphasize, though, that Julian is Augustus for less than 2 years. He takes power in November of 361 and he dies in the summer of 363. All of this happens in a little bit around 19 months. It's an extremely short reign. It's not much longer than the reign of such notable emperors as Vitellius or Tacitus. This is not a long period of time to be in power, but yet Julian does a huge amount. And Julian's actions capture the imagination of both pagans and Christians for hundreds of years. Now, the last thing to talk about is how Julian dies. And Julian dies in a way that, in some ways is perfectly Julianic. Julian decides that he is going to mount a spectacular invasion of Persian territory. And he assembles one of the largest Roman forces of all of the forces assembled in the 4th century. And Julian's plan is to take 2 armies to the border of Persia and to send them out in 2 separate directions and have them converge on the Persian capital of Ctesiphon. Now, this is something that had been tried before. Alexander Severus actually tried to do this with 3 armies in the early 230s. It was very hard to do this kind of thing, but this is Julian's style, to break his forces up, have them move quickly, converge at a certain moment that's strategically chosen, and hopefully have things work out. But the problem that Julian has is the armies do not link up. One army gets down towards Ctesiphon, but the Persians flood the irrigation canals across what's now northern and central Iraq, and the second army is delayed. And then Julian is forced to retreat, and during the retreat, the Persian forces kind of harry and disrupt the supplies that Julian's army is able to get. And during one of these kind of lightning attacks by the Persians, Julian marches out without a breastplate and he's stabbed. He initially has the wound cauterized, and he holds on for a little more than a day or so until eventually, from loss of blood and other things, Julian dies on campaign. Now, the loss of this the loss of Julian during this campaign is something that everybody notes. Julian's idea was that this Persian campaign would mark him and sort of certify the divine approval that he had been claiming and that he firmly believed he possessed. Constantine had actually embarked on a Persian campaign and had died before he was able to bring it to execution. And what Julian hoped to do was to one-up Constantine by fighting in this particular way and winning a victory that Constantine could not. He didn't. And because of this, Christian sources celebrate the death of Julian. They celebrate the death of Julian so much that a Christian tradition arises that Julian was actually not killed by Persians, that Julian was instead killed by a Christian soldier, Saint Mercurius, and that therefore Mercurius, because he killed the pagan emperor Julian, has achieved a kind of holy status on the level of the martyrs and others. And this, in a nutshell, reflects the problematic legacy left by Julian. The supporters of Julian not only loved Julian, but they actually would claim that his Persian campaign was effectively a success that was sabotaged by his successor Jovian. Christians saw Julian as a horrible figure. They struggle to frame him in language that marks him as a persecutor. And in this way, they struggle to put him in the category of figures like Decius and Valerian, who die on campaign because they persecuted Christians. The reality is Julian incited incredible passions. The people who loved Julian absolutely loved him. He becomes idealized by pagans and especially pagan intellectuals, but he is loathed by Christians. But no one could turn away. And for centuries, even though Julian was only emperor for 19 months, he is one of the most interesting and consequential of all Roman emperors, because the imagination that surrounded Julian was so great that it makes him a timeless figure. And this is important to keep in mind.